Let me put that on the record. Two fantastic papers, much appreciated by all of us here, I think. And one of the things that I like about the work that both George and Andrew do is to obviously apply all kinds of categories that we're familiar with from so-called Enlightenment traditions, but also to modify those, but also show, in George's case over many decades, how those so-called Enlightenment traditions actually are logocentrically interdependent on an excluded other. Just thought I'd throw that in, wake people up. Spirit of Derrida lives on here in the OC. In the right place. So, moving right along, I'd like to invite people to ask some questions, but I wanted to ask one first, if I could, to Andrew, and it was actually about an aside, but it is quite an interesting one, particularly given the Olympics, and some of you will have noted that Yudice Zhao is coming here next week for 3 or 4 days. Zhao will be coming here directly from doing a project for the PRC about the Olympics there in Beijing to report to us, as it were, on what went on there. But it strikes me as very odd that sport, again, this was an aside, is constantly excluded from these discussions. And you said this might be a time to talk about why, and I just wondered if you had an account as to why that might be and what that implied. Because the same thing could be said about Latin America, where football is, in a sense, an incredible cultural crucible right across Latin America, as it is across all but 4% of the world's most benighted 4% of the world's population. It is the most important cultural crucible by far, outstripping any of the other categories we've discussed in every conceivable way: popularity, social significance, and so on. Not to say that I'm a football fan, but there it is. So I just wondered if you might comment on why buildings matter as culture and creativity, pianos matter as culture and creativity, and sport doesn't.
Can I just add that in thinking about sport, it's also the way in which certain sports, perhaps new sports or new articulations of various sports, have become highlighted under the sign of the neoliberal. One thinks of extreme sports, one thinks of surfing, one thinks of just a whole range of beach volleyball, whatever, that assume a kind of professionalization at this moment in time, right, in relation to certain sorts of urban but also global safari trajectories.
Right.
And how that gets played out.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because they're also, the ethos of these extreme sports is one that's sort of risk averse, and it's so very consonant with the neoliberal ethos of entrepreneurial audacity. I knew Toby would cotton on to this. I knew he would respond to the aside, so it was really for his benefit, I think. I think there's, I don't know if I have very good answers, but certainly in the Chinese case, a lot of it is expediency. A lot of it has to do with the Olympics, obviously, and the role that the Olympics has the sort of ridiculously magnified role the Olympics has played in the Chinese narrative of ascendancy. And it also helps if you have, if you live in a country where sports, where success in sports is on the ascendancy, which it clearly is, as we can see from day to day in the tally of gold medals and so on and so forth. It'd be interesting to contrast that with, the London Olympics, where, sports has been on the decline. Success in sports has been on the decline for the best part of half a century.
Women breaststrokers.
Notwithstanding. Notwithstanding. Yeah. But I think it's a very interesting question. As Toby knows, we started a sports research workshop in my department this year at NYU, which is devoted to trying to look at how the competition for high-skilled talent in sports, the global competition, is producing these migration streams from the global south into the global north, and in ways that are really quite consonant with the markets for high-skilled talent in other fields and in other industries. And there are definitely specific characteristics that apply to sports activities that distinguish them from other industrial sectors, that you can treat them in more or less the same analytical ways. And especially when it comes to labor markets and the debate about liberalization of labor markets. My last comment is actually about the distinction with buildings, because sports stadia, I mean, I think the one exception to that comment is sports stadia, which have been such a central anchor for urban and regional development in so many cities, and tragically, so few examples of them having proved to be successful as drivers of development. But nonetheless, that built environment is still very powerful and speaks very influentially to Chamber of Commerce elites, wherever they are, because they're usually about downtown locations, and they're there to drive up land value, which is the language that Chamber of Commerce elites like to hear.
I mean, this question comes up all the time, because I totally agree with this zeal that it's utterly bizarre that sport is not included in these kind of policy things, or not seen in the same kind of way. But I think there's two reasons, in a sense. One is to do with the organisation sometimes. It's a kind of cock-up rather than conspiracy thing. The organisation of policy towards the arts and towards sport in many countries simply doesn't bring them together in that kind of way. So to some degree, if your culture ministry doesn't have anything to do with the provision of sport or with policy towards sport, it just doesn't happen in the way. But I think also there is also resistance on the part of the traditional arts. You've got to remember the culture ministries in lots of countries are still dominated by a kind of high art spending view of the world. And when I do these talks in Australia, which is probably the best example of a country that should have sport as its cultural export numero uno kind of thing, what I hear generally from arts people is, oh Christ, no. We spend so much money on sport as it is, we'll get nothing if we include sport in these things. So I think there's a tension, I mean, not here, obviously, but amongst a lot of people about, arts versus sports when it comes to kind of funding, when it comes to prestige, when it comes to all those kind of issues that actually accounts practically for why sport is included, rather than it being a kind of conceptual problem that people can't understand that culture, sport is culture.
Yeah, but the academics exclude it too.
Yeah, they do. No, absolutely. I agree.
Just want to add that some of the countries that had sports in the ministry, like Costa Rica, the Ministry of Youth, Culture and Sport, eliminated sport.
Yeah. Well, Britain has a Ministry
But not
of
in
Culture and
Britain.
Sport.
Yeah.
No, they still have it, yeah. But even when it had sport in it,
Yeah.
the person in charge of sport never really cooperated
Yeah.
with the person in charge of culture.
Juan.
I just wanted to add that perhaps sports is a good example. It's a newer field, but even in Latin America now there are a number of people doing serious studies of sports. But in connection with our topic, I thought that sports is a good example of that divide between what gets appropriated and industrialized in a monetized model, and the practice itself at the community level, which goes on regardless of support or lack thereof. So that in soccer, for example, which is one of the big global sports, and I'm also a fan of soccer, the TV industry around soccer is monumental, and the kind of money that migratory populations produce for big companies by paying over the web fees to watch the local tournaments while living elsewhere, or to watch the different European and Latin American soccer tournaments. That is a major economic component, and it produces enormous amount of money. That on the one hand, so that the media, sports turn into a media performance is big economic business, and it would be worth quantifying, and there are people already doing so. But on the other hand, there is the unstructured, social, community-driven aspect of or side of sports that in soccer is particularly obvious, that goes on regardless of whether there is grass, regardless of whether there are goals, regardless of whether the ball is good, and it goes all over the place. It goes on all over the place without needing to be incentivized. In between, In a few cases here in the US, for example, certain municipalities have used the construction of sports facilities center around soccer fields, free, open, public soccer fields of the AstroTurf kind, to produce spaces of cohabitation between migrant populations and white populations as way of creating sort of an assimilation field, literally, that can smooth out some of the relationship between these populations. So some kind of cultural policy around building minimal infrastructure and social uses of sports is being developed here in the U.S. too.
Which is close to Barcelona, 45 minutes away. There's a huge amount of immigrants there, and they use soccer as with the same purposes as you were mentioning before. I've read several books. As a matter of fact, I was going to write my dissertation on soccer chants, and until they convinced me that I was not going to get a job, so I changed it and I did something else. But among many of the books that I read, I think the one that I really encourage anybody who is interested in that is Eduardo Archetti's football, polo, and tango in Argentina, and well, that's it.
I think the IP element is pretty crucial, though, isn't it, Toby? I mean, the fact that you cannot readily generate IP. I mean, that has to be a sort of basic common element to what drives creative industries policy making. And the fact you cannot do that readily in sports, you can do it in sportswear and the like, and in sort of ancillary services, but you can't do it in sports itself, right? Can you?
Well, it's an interesting point, just very quickly. Deloitte, a company that George was mentioning earlier, in which neither he nor I has a financial interest as far as we know, has an annual sports report that lists the top 25 football teams, soccer teams. And the interesting thing is that there are, it's always a battle between Real Madrid, Barcelona, Manchester United, Arsenal. So it's for those are Spanish and British-based teams, though they may be owned by people who own NFL teams, or they may be owned by local communities, or they may be endorsed by UNICEF, but nevertheless, that's where they're physically located. And the interesting thing is that those that rely exclusively on TV rights, which is IP, tend to slip up and down the top 25 ratings. Those that rely exclusively on crowd attendance tend to slip up and down based on things, not so much the economy, but more regulation of crowd entry prices. But those that can use merchandise effectively, in concert with the other two revenue streams, do incredibly well. So the reason why none of the German teams, an extremely wealthy country, despite what people might like to think, still the biggest exporter in the world, those teams do nothing at all because they've never worked out how to merchandise, and because people outside Germany hate Germany, and so no one wants to wear their football team shirt.
No, but I would say that's still merchandising and spin-off. It's not the central it's not the central experiential element of sports, which you can't trademark a move or a set of moves or a technique.
I think on the issue of sports and your latest comment, Toby, regarding the merchandising, I think merchandising has a big impact on the sports industry in the sense that most profits are derived from the merchandising, as a parallel byproduct of the sporting itself, might further include it in a traditional economy rather than a creative industries. That's just a fleeting thought for the moment. But Andrew's initial answer brought another question, which regards to migratory patterns and diaspora communities with regard to the creative industries themselves in developed countries per se. I think what it seems to me, there's also a sort of exodus in the same sense as the high-tech industry, whereas the high-skilled talent from the south has migrated to the north to seek out better paid jobs rather than to serve the national statehoods or industries, whether they exist or not exist in their own countries. And I was wondering if you could probably comment in the context of China, a bit perhaps more complicated, but in the context of South America, those in which migratory patterns, likewise in the high-tech industry and the creative industries, has affected the potential for creative industries or creative societies to be sort of emerge in these localities?
Well, just very quickly, again, I think, and I should say that the topic I've been discussing or presenting here is not an area of expertise for myself. I mean, I'm sort of piggybacking on research I've mostly done in technology-intensive sector in China, which is what I really know about, not about this topic. But pari passu, the fact is that Chinese industrial policy in the creative field is very much modeled on high-tech industrial policy, and as I tried to accentuate in my presentation, that is a model that is being followed. If that is indeed the case, then there will be a kind of open invitation, and there is to some degree a limited invitation already for returnees to come back to China, as there was in the high-tech fields and so on and so forth. Very successful invitation for the most part. And but again, in the field of culture, it's a little complicated because a lot of the folks who left the country didn't necessarily do so because of the pursuit of riches elsewhere. They did so because of what they did and said wasn't acceptable in China. So it's a little more fraught when you encourage returnees to come back and get involved there. I mean, that Zhang Yimou, the director who stage managed the opening ceremonies, it was a wonderful choice in many respects because of all the problems he's had in the past with Beijing, and to be able to openly exhibit that someone like him with that troubled history was now at the sort of pinnacle and in the limelight and given this huge nationalistic task, cultural task to perform was a perfect example. I mean, a wonderful choice in many regards. And if our returnees were to be treated the same way, then that would be interesting. But again, the jury is still out. It's not clear that that's... Yeah.
In the Latin American context, the large countries like Brazil do not have the same problem. Sorry. So it's not the same issue in Brazil. For example, I'm not referring to sport, where Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, and so on and so forth, or elsewhere, or ending their careers, some of them. But in the field of cultural production, Brazil is a major producer of music, and obviously in film it's another story. So you do get the case of Walter Salles, Fernando Meirelles, like the Mexican filmmakers making their way around and producing films with Hollywood arrangements, so on and so forth. But at the level of music, and here we have to talk about sector-specific issues. Music is an absolutely transformed industry. So it no longer matters that you're going to be producing for Sony, Emmy, Warner, because there are so many other alternatives and so many other business models that are emerging that that you don't have to do what was done in the 90s, which is the reason why Shakira, los Cadillacs, and so on and so forth would go through the Emilio Estefan processing machine, right? And try to break into the U.S. and internationally, so on and so forth. That has changed. You don't need for music to be vetted through Miami, whereas in the past, zillions of musicians went that route. Some of them through Los Angeles as well. So in music, what's really exciting are the new models of circulation, and including business models. Now, in countries like Central America, where you don't have any major producers of music, of television, of film, of book publishing, there are some interesting initiatives that have emerged. For example, there is a new Central American plus Caribbean fund for filmmaking, and it's been a great initiative because it's managed to finance, I don't know, like 50 films in the last year. So like 3 in Costa Rica, several in the Dominican Republic. It's an emerging situation over the last few years. And in the realm of music, the smaller labels have all banded together to provide distribution and other forms of circulation of music. So there's an incipient regional approach by necessity, because when you're too small, you can't possibly compete in any way. But if you have some regional arrangements, there's greater possibility.
Okay, so we'll go there, then there, then here.
Okay, both of you mentioned tourism briefly, and I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail on the relationship between tourism and the cultural industries, both in developing nations and the global north.
Well, going back to Central America, where I've been doing research on this, several of the musicians, aside from these regional arrangements, like record labels banding together, musicians have sought ways of supporting their music making so that they can make a living. And one of the ways that they've made a living is piggybacking on another sector. Tourism is one of the major sectors. So there's a label in Costa Rica named Papaya Music that has created a lot of with really great musicians, but that relate in some way to the environmental sector, since Costa Rica also has a very strong environmental policy. And it's, in a sense, packaging, right, some of these issues around other sectors that are more dynamic in order to get some action in that way. Same thing with cultural tourism. This label does extremely well because it sells in all the places where the tourists are. Now, that creates a very strange situation, which is more tourists are likely to know the Costa Rican musicians than the residents, except for the fans that go to the concerts, which is, and there's quite a large fan base for the really good musicians. So there's one added issue to the cultural tourism and the labels, but it just escaped me. The environmental one, the tourism one, and well, escaped. Anthony. I lost the thought.
Who's on first?
Default position.
China, Chinese tourism is massive. Everything in China is massive. It's size complex there. Rivals Texas. But predominantly it's heritage cultural tourism, I would say. I mean, there are some people who come to look at urbanization. I mean, the impact and the affect of urbanization. There are nightclubs and so on. I mean, nightclub tourism, I don't think people are drawn specifically to China to go to nightclubs and the like, but there certainly there are good nightclubs there. I would say it's mostly cultural heritage tourism, and it's most pronounced, I think, if you look at the domestic tourist industry. I mean, the sort of sacred sites like Buddhist mountains and so on and so forth, and the feudal heritage sites all around China. You go there and you won't find many foreigners at those sites, but you'll find masses and masses of Chinese tourists who are encouraged. I mean, that's domestic tourism, and for the most part that's the case.
Yangtze River.
Huh?
Yangtze River. There's tours up the Yangtze River, 3 gorges there.
Endlessly. Yeah, and don't go on them.
Oh, they're terrible.
It's like watching paint dry.
Yeah.
3 days on the Yangtze.
But they're quite extraordinary in the sense of the selling of China to itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right, if you watch, the aspirin China's middle class
Mm-hmm.
being sold China. I mean, literally being sold China. Pay and you will get.
And that kind of mobility is relatively recent. Of course, one always has to remember that, even domestic mobility. So the idea of going somewhere else, the other end of the country, to see something you've only been told about, is quite novel in a way.
there's one more aspect of the, depending on the country, but that obviously who gets targeted in heritage tourism are not white middle-class executives. They're usually indigenous groups or Afro-descendants.
Yeah.
And in some countries that has led to very problematic situations of hotels being built in areas where these communities have lived. So there's been a lot of activism around that. In fact, some of the musicians worked with some of these groups who come from those communities, and it turns out that if you take a region like Central America that's not known as having an Afro-Central American population, what has happened is that they've emerged as visible and as entered into a national dialogue and have, in terms of music, displaced a lot of what goes on in the rest of Central America. And so some of the music is linked to the cultural heritage of those groups, and in some cases to even the struggles around environmental issues. I'm writing a piece about a fellow named Guillermo Anderson from Honduras, and I highly recommend his music.
Okay, Alejandro, then Amar.
Yeah. Hello? You can hear me? My question is specifically Mexico. George, factors such as transnational migration, dual citizenship, migra dollars that you mentioned, borderless economy, what impact does that have? Is it a positive impact on creative industries, or is it
Yes.
less positive? Or?
Someone, I don't know if it was you, someone at some point mentioned narco corridos and corridos. Well, it's one of the largest sectors in what we could call the Latino or Latin music industry. It's something that actually was not known, really very visible across the country until the Latin Grammys were displaced from Miami to LA. And because the people on the East Coast with tropical music, salsa and other music, always thought this is Latin music. Then the Grammys are held in LA, and there's this evidence, well, more than 60% of sales in the Latin music market are Mexican genres. Banda, norteño.
I guess I'm thinking again of community in Mexico, for example. You know, the person who comes here and he works here,
Right.
And he sends migra dollars back. What impact does that have, for example, in the community and development of smaller little towns, you know, where these people
There's
live?
a lot of work on that because there are several things. There are some cultural effects. In some cases, even architectural styles might change slightly. There's been work done on people who will incorporate, sort of, you know, whether they're the cable, the satellite dishes, or have a building with 2 stories instead of just 1 story. There's a whole series of things that become evident to people in the local communities of who's gotten the remittances, who's moved back, so on and so forth. So it creates an interesting transnational situation within what used to be called the sender community. So there are issues there. Sometimes, well, there's been a lot of work on this. Sometimes there's the work of Roger Rouse a long time ago about political relations that hold sometimes in both situations. There's a whole series of effects.
But you get interesting ones when there's a surveillance model. So people who are very successful here will say they want to put money not just into their families, but into, say, city renovation. But because they're worried about corruption, they set up a webcam so they can see what's being built. It's quite common.
This is not exactly a cultural industry issue, but the one thing that has been debated, a policy about remittances, is whether or not governments should control the remittances so that the remittances are productive to the national economy in the way the government ministries imagine them. And that's something that's been resisted, obviously, by the migrants and the people who sent the remittance or received them.
It was developed, the concept of social remittances, to describe some of the back and forth of cultural impacts. But then, because of Alejandro's question, because of concerns like Alejandro's, the concept of cultural remittances has been developed.
I have an article on that.
I know you do. And so that's Juan Flores. But I wanted to mention the fact that this has been codified in the concept of cultural remittances to describe the way in which what the migrant communities that move back and forth or that visit with certain regularity or that send money, capital, to their sending communities are also having both an impact in the places from which they came and that they visit, and also maybe borrowing from the places in which now reside a number of cultural traits that themselves may be having an impact in those communities.
I guess I just wanted to, I'm glad that my colleague brought up tourism, because that's also what I've been thinking a lot about. And just wanted to push that point a little bit. I think many of the phenomenon we're talking about in this seminar, 7 or 8 years ago would have been talked about in terms of tourism development models, from the UNESCO to city development commissions to processes of globalization and global city articulation. So I'm wondering, what is being, and in my own work, which is about the policing of tourism, often policing the difference between those who are artists or entrepreneurs and those who are delegitimized and lose the status of being artists and entrepreneurs and are called, prostitutes or traffickers, right? So I'm wondering, in that shift from tourism as a development model, which does include sports industries and sex industries, sports sex culture is the tourism development model. It's more inclusive. And in tourists, in terms of training, cultural encounter, as well as all kinds of other service encounters between different kinds of consumers and producers, is a very broad model. But we know in the 90s, UNESCO turned against it while also promoting it. And the metaphor of the prostitute became dominant internationally, the model of a sex slave, slavery and prostitution together, and even now the new kind of white slavery language that UNESCO talks a lot about, made tourism delegitimized it a lot. But I'm wondering, do you recognize or do you think that there is a specific strategic shift from tourism development towards cultural industries? Who is being cut out? I think maybe that sports being cut out of the model is not just like the people are not being flexible enough, but I think there's actually a carving out of maybe vulgar or more inclusive development models and focusing on the artists. I know in Egypt, there's this huge debate, like if you're a fannaneya or if you're a sharmuta, if you're a slut or if you're an artist. If you're an artist, then your profession is okay. If you're not quite an artist, then you're a prostitute, and you're no longer legitimized in the tourist industry. And there's a lot of work that goes in to the policing and the performance of what you are, whether you're going to be called an artist or whether you're going to be called a prostitute. And the metaphor of the prostitute comes to dominate tourism, and the metaphor of the artist dominates culture. So I'm just thinking, is there a shift, and does that represent class polarization or urban development difference, moving from tourism to culture?
In the case of Caribbean and Central America, it's still tourism. Tourism is the major. In Dominican Republic and in Costa Rica, in Nicaragua, so on and so forth, it's the largest contributor to the gross national product. And given that, policy drives tourism. In the case of Costa Rica, it drives greater land preservation, because it's ecotourism and adventure tourism. So it's not about to be transformed into culture industry tourism. Where there's an opening is for culture industries to piggyback on tourism. But no one in some of these countries would imagine the displacement of cultural tourism to culture or creative industries. Certainly not in these areas. That's still but there is the question about sex tourism. When you go to the airport, you see one of those cardboard cutouts of somebody with a sign over here that says that if you have sex with someone under 18, you're going to go to jail. Of course, it almost never happens, but that's pardon me?
The sex or the jail?
The jail. Sex always happens.
We're going to have 2 more questions, comments, Steve and Alejandro, and then I have a brand new day.
What?
A brand new day. A new idea.
Oh.
My question actually was regarding China, so if your question's on the same thread, maybe I'll defer to you first.
And that is the question is the following. It seems to me that tourism, you mentioned tourism, and these cultural industries, have they, for example, had an effect on changing attitudes toward, I guess, a cultural industry like prostitution, right? And that, as your examples were, that if you're not an artist, you're a prostitute, and it's a very negative thing. But have for example, things like Club Meds, and I heard this term a while back at a lecture. A woman was talking about Club Med prostitution, Club Med relationships, which was a completely different kind, according to her, of prostitution. And that women that participated in this were not considered as negative as, let's say, a woman who was hustling on the street. And this kind of prostitution was you find it a lot in Cuba, and I think in Cuba it's called jinetera. And what that means is that this woman, a young woman, I guess even with the permission of her family, is working at, let's say, El Hotel Nacional, and there's an Italian businessman that comes there 3 or 4 times, or let's say twice a month, and this goes on, and she recognizes this. She begins to develop a relationship with this man, and this relationship goes on, and he invites her to go to dinner, buys clothes for her, etc., etc., and I guess eventually sex happens, right? But it's not considered necessarily prostitution. So I'm wondering, it has attitudes, these what we're talking about here, creative industries, et cetera, has there been an impact toward how people, in third world countries look at things such as prostitution?
Actually, before we even talked about cultural tourism or cultural industries, that always happened. That people would go down to the preferred tropical places, Puerto Rico or other places, and have these relationships. When I was a kid, I knew people like that who would have long-standing and same-sex, where somebody's married, a guy's married, but the guy from New York goes down and he has an ongoing relationship, and part of the money is to keep the family going, so on and so forth. And now, well, probably not just now, but if you open up the newspaper in Costa Rica, you see ads. Gringo coming down for 2 months, looking for, good-looking woman, educated, speaks English, from 18 to 28, blah, 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 for, good times and so on and so forth. And that will establish the kind of thing you're saying.
It's always difficult to follow questions of the erotic. But I had a question for Andrew about the geopolitics of cultural policy within China. I can't remember where I read this. It may very well have been in your book, but there's the analysis that, in fact, there are 3 Chinas that operate semi-autonomously. There's the coastal plain China, which Beijing is included in that group of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, perhaps 1 or 2 other cities that are very close to the coast, very much influenced by rapid immigration and by global trade. They are the kind of global cultural capitals, if you will, of the Pacific Rim. You go further inland and you have a second China, which is the inland urban centers, huge cities by any measure, but not part of that, again, kind of coastal cultural capital group. And then finally, the third China is the non-urban inland China. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the way that Beijing maps cultural policy and the kind of strategies you're talking about, is there attention being paid to these other 2 Chinas? Clearly, Beijing, Shanghai, the coastal plains receiving a lot of attention in terms of Beijing, but are these huge cities, are they being focused on as technological or cultural capitals of tomorrow? And, basically, are they being recognized within this kind of strategic scheme of China reinventing itself in the ways that you've talked about?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, certainly in
You're on.
I'm on.
You're now off.
Certainly in the in the technology fields. I mean, that's been the case for a long, long time. You know, the effort to equalize or some way compensate for the uneven development that's been pretty chronic element of industrial policy in the reform era. With the creative industry stuff, it's I mean, it's in the major cities right now. Although Chongqing, which is very much inland, but still a tourist site for the most part, and perhaps in Chengdu as well, in Sichuan, you're beginning to see these sites being cultivated, by which I mean that you know, local party officials have been given permission to create creative clusters, pretty much along the lines of, you know, creative industries policy making in Europe and other places, but also very much modeled on the industrial parks, the high-tech industrial parks with which the party officials are familiar and have some experience in managing and cultivating. The advantage of that, of course, is not only that some of these sites could be available for arts-based tourism, and to some degree they are in the cities already, you know, the converted factories and so on and so forth in Shanghai and Beijing. But also, you know, you put all the artists and folks together in the art city model that David was describing this morning. It's very easy to surveil them. And you keep them all in one place, you can keep an eye on them. So there is an element of surveillance that is involved in creating these places. And the last element, of course, is that they are they're able to exhibit for export their wares very easily and very conveniently in one location. I mean, they're like large arts shopping centers in a way, where foreign tourists, certainly in the art world, will come through and visit galleries and buy, quite frankly. And that model, insofar as it's possible, will probably be extended to, you know, other sectors, multimedia sectors, and so on and so forth. But certainly there are some elements that are also not place-specific whatsoever. Think about, you know, gold farming, which is this phenomenon where armies of Chinese youth are employed to play online video games on behalf of time-starved players in Western countries. I mean, they create avatars and they play the games and they build up virtual currency online for players in other countries. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. It applies hundreds of thousands of people. And you obviously don't need to be in a city to do that. You can be very far inland. That's a very interesting phenomenon.